All right, hello everybody. So I'm going to begin. This is History of Photography with Imani Hadden. This is week 4, New Politics and the Birth of the Celebrity. So this is the Progressive Era and the Jazz Age from the early 1900s to the 1920s. My contact information. So I'm Imani Hadden Photography. My Instagram is my first name and my last name, Imani Hadden. That's my email at gmail.com. And I am available for career building and mentorship for high schoolers in the Antelope Valley. So that's the Lancaster and Palmdale regions. So my background, I have a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Photography and a double minor in Art History and Architecture. I'm a personal and public event photographer, a real estate photographer, and a visual artist. So some general Zoom and Meetup housekeeping rules. Please stay muted with your screens turned off. I'll have questions at the end. There's no homework, no note-taking required, and no testing. So in the late 19th century, photography and chemistry developed to have silver gelatin paper in 1874. This became commercially available. And as you can see, there's different layers within the paper for the images to be added onto through the photochemical process. And so this meant no more adding chemicals to paper by hand like the albumin prints, the daguerreotypes and calotypes had. They are now phased out. The print out paper process, the POP process. So POP paper is placed under a negative, is then exposed to natural light, sunlight, or a kerosene lamp. The paper is washed to dissolve excess silver salts and is toned with gold and then platinum toners. This is for the color element. The POP paper is washed and fixed again with sodium thiosulfate, and it is washed and air dried, then mounted after being straightened out. So here's samples of warm tone POP process photos. There's women in the one on the left-hand side, and then there's a coach and buggy on the right-hand side. So people took pictures of their everyday lives. There were early prototypal cameras. So Kodak had a camera, and their advertisement for it was, "You press the button, we do the rest." In 1888, George Eastman marketed the Kodak #1, which is a box camera. In 1895, the Lumiere brothers presented the cinematograph, which is a camera, projector, and film printer all in one. And this was the early days of the movies. In 1898, Alta Vista produced the first mass-produced panoramic camera. So this had an automated portion in the front, which moved from right to left or left to right, depending on however it was wound. And this was in order to take panoramic pictures. A lot of people were moving throughout the United States, coming in contact with the outdoors, and they bought and used these cameras to take pictures. 1900, Eastman Kodak produced the Brownie camera, which sold for $1. So this was readily available for many people, and it was a great thing for people to have. And combining that with the commercially produced paper, people were able to make their own images. So new politics in the progressive era. This was an era of social activism and political reform. So there was a high regulation on child labor. This is the era when children were taken from the factories and warehouses to longer hours in school and education. In 1906, Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which talked about the very disgusting and dirty parts of the meat handling industry, the milk industry, the cheese industries, eggs. So anything having to do with poultry, dairy, produced, packaged, and bottled foods he spoke on. And food handling reforms and worker exploitation were also covered, as well as the food mishandling of those industries. There was the formation of worker unions, which was very much necessary. People were demanding higher pay for their hours and lower hours. Back then, the hours were unregulated. So as many hours as a person can work, that's as many hours as you were on the clock. It's kind of unheard of today. We have a strict selected 9 to 5 or a sliding scale earlier or a little later than that. But back then, people had to lobby for this. President Roosevelt put together the national parklands and system. So previously, when people were moving across the United States, there was this idea that from the East Coast to the West Coast, everywhere would be developed. And Theodore Roosevelt loved the outdoors. And so he made it a point to put together the national park system in order to reserve lands. Women's voters' rights movement, the suffrage movement, was also very big. Women were being jailed for showing up to voter polls, and it was understood that American citizens primarily focused on men being able to vote, and so there was acts added in order for women to be able to vote. Then later, men of color as well as women of color. During this time, there was great restriction in conservatism due to World War I, causing 40 million casualties. This is including persons that are fighting, civilians, military personnel, and individuals that are wounded. And during that time, from 1918 to 1919, the influenza pandemic was concurrently going with the end of World War I, and that caused 50 million casualties. So there was a very somber mindset among the people. This was the end of the Victorian era, the early Edwardian era, and this is when old mannerisms of the yesteryears died hard. There was strict rules on courtship, so men and women had to go through many steps and processes in order to formally be interested in order to date each other. So many steps even before marriage. There was not much mixing of the genders. Men and women sat arm's length apart. Even if men would lean in, such as the woman in the middle, she is having to present herself as not being very interested. And eventually you'd get to the last step, which is the marriage, in which she can show that she's interested because her husband has indeed married her. Motherhood was also a Victorian value. Families had up to 8, 9 children at the most, but at least 3 to 4. And women were expected to stay home and have traditional feminine roles, such as cooking, cleaning, sewing, child rearing, and teaching their daughters to do the same. So next became the Jazz Age, which people shifted their mindsets. First with the music, Bessie Smith, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Ma Rainey were some of the African-American musicians, singers that put together jazz music. It came out of the American South, and it was influenced by the African-American experience. The new aesthetics were implied and carried over into new mindsets in the Jazz Age, comparing Victorian era women who were modest, fully clothed, and domestic compared to their daughters and granddaughters who were the Jazz Age women who drank, smoked, wore clothing that exposed their ankles. It was a very different mindset. Victorian women were family-centered, domesticated. Women's education didn't pass junior high, and they wore modest clothing, where their daughters and granddaughters enjoyed single life dating and socializing. They had entertainment lifestyles. And these women attended college and worked. This is the beginning of women getting out of the domesticated lifestyle. And they also wore revealing fashion, which is in stark contrast to the Victorian values that their mothers and grandmothers had. So, what was so different and startling? Short hair and hemlines, makeup and decadent accessories. Women in Victorian era didn't wear makeup unless they were considered women of the night, prostitutes. And in the 1920s, it became a normalized social thing to wear mascara, lipstick, draw on your eyebrows, wear eyeshadow. You are no longer considered arrogant or showy by having a fur-lined collar, like the woman in the third image, and having a shorter hemline was normal. Showing your shoulders also came into vogue, which was very startling to the Victorian mothers and grandmothers in that time, who did not condone of that. There was also illicit after-hour jazz parties. And so teenagers and youth would dance to jazz music. They would cohabitate in rooms overnight in groups together. And that was the end of Victorian values for the youth. They did not embrace it. They drank, they danced wildly, and they partied hard. Even at the beach, there was the fashion police. Quite literally, the fashion police are measuring this young lady's bathing dress. It was too short. So, birth of the celebrity. In this era, many people became celebrities through the silent film industry. Florence Lawrence was the first silent film movie star, and it is noted on her headstone, the Biograph Girl, the first movie star. Louise Brooks was the first female sex symbol, and her looks varied from the Victorian era looks because she had dark hair, which she cut short. She appeared in films nude. She also wore men's clothing, which was considered very taboo for the Victorian era. Men wore men's clothing and women wore women's clothing. And so in her films, she would do this concept called gender bending, in which she would don men's clothing. Charlie Chaplin was the first silent film comedian. His work made its way across the United States, and in Europe, he was famous across the ocean. The birth of celebrity Anna May Wong was the first Asian American to be in film, and she made it a point to learn multiple languages so that when it came time for her movies to go overseas, she could continue to star in her films and make that money while dubbing her movies and films into other languages. And Frida Josephine McDonald, aka Josephine Baker, was born in St. Louis, Missouri on June 13, 1906. She grew up in a very impoverished family, in a very impoverished household. Her parents were stars in their own way. They performed. And so she got her idea to be a performer from her mother and her father. She worked as a child from the age of 8 until 13 as a maid for white American women who were older, and they did not treat her right from what I've read, and she had a very difficult life taking care of children, their grandchildren, and she was a child herself. She ran away to be a waitress in the Old Chauffeurs Club in St. Louis at 13 years old, where she got a taste for the performance life. And she worked at the height of segregation and racism in St. Louis, Missouri. And you see her on the left with two white American men dressed in blackface, minstrel. And this was very much okay. People couldn't really show disdain towards it. It was considered comedic and funny, but today we understand that it is very racist. However, she preferred to perform in the right, how she has her furs, her feathers, her flowers. So she liked her more feminine, beautiful roles rather than playing opposite in these sort of racist, archaic performances. She moved to Europe with many other African American performers after being discovered by Caroline Reagan, who was a talent scout in New York City. So she encouraged her and the people she was performing with to travel. Caroline Reagan arranged for them to be paid. And before they were getting paid significantly less in the United States, people loved the shows in the United States, but did not want to be seen enjoying these performances. She was encouraged to appropriate the African stereotype. So we had the image of the African woman posed by European colonists from week 2. And she realized upon going to Europe that this is a profitable way to get her name out there, to perform, to be seen, and to make money. She exaggerated the African stereotype. This is called the banana dance, and she did this for white audiences across Europe. And she became very famous for her dances as well as her singing. And these GIFs are from the early 1920s. This is 1925 and 26, the banana dance. This one was put on in Paris, and she created a literal skirt out of bananas, had a bunch of shells and beads around her neck and earrings. She was wildly popular in Europe. On the left is a film that she was in, and it's a still GIF image. Are you in love? Is he handsome? All lovers are handsome, she responds. And this would have been unseen in the United States. European women gathering around an African American woman would have never happened in the United States. On the right are her performance posters. She was performing in France as well as Germany, the Netherlands, and other European countries. And she embraced the narrative of the nègre, which was French for black. There's also German for black. She embraced her blackness. Whatever stereotype, she took it and subverted it and used it to make money. And her accolades, she worked as a French spy and had access to high profile events and took pictures at Nazi bases. They did not suspect her. They thought she was simply a performer. She spoke multiple languages while taking up residency in Europe. She openly opposed Jim Crow when she returned to the United States and marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights era. And she adopted many unwanted children of all races. She was a phenomenal person when it comes to opening the gates for what we consider the performance industry. So taking a step back, where do we see the influence of the jazz age? We see it in music videos. Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back. Towards the middle of the music video, there's a woman dancing in a banana skirt, which is a direct reference to Josephine Baker's banana skirt, banana dance in 1925. Beyonce did a tribute to Baker on her 100th birthday in 2006, performing in a stylized Josephine Baker banana skirt. And Madame Tussauds created a wax figure of Baker in order to memorialize her as an important figure. Josephine Baker is also seen in fashion. her references by Diana Ross, Rihanna. It looks like Kendall Jenner and Bella Hadid have also slicked their hair down for a fashion show in the Baker fashion. Other women have worn the 1920s flapper style dress with the large and bright beads in order to reference Baker as well as the Jazz Age. We also see it in film. Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby with Tobey Maguire, Carey Mulligan, Joel Edgerton, and Leonardo DiCaprio came out. And this was based on The Great Gatsby, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is the first piece of literature in 1925 to coin the phrase Jazz Age. That phrase did not exist before Fitzgerald penned it on paper. So he's a pioneer for naming an age and time of decadence and partying. And Baz Luhrmann's film was the first film adaptation of The Great Gatsby to use hip-hop jazz fusion to relate the intrigue both genres had on American citizens at their time. So how we hear hip-hop jingles and commercials just so casually, people rapping over some sort of rhythmic beat, it's you almost don't even hear it anymore until you really pay attention and go, oh, that's rap music, that's hip hop music. Well, that hip hop today was what jazz was for the people in America and in Europe and pretty much the rest of the world in the 1920s. People really loved jazz music compared to the more subdued classical styles of the Victorian era. There was no dancing, there was no touching, there was no loud partying, and the jazz era changed that. And in the film, The Great Gatsby, you see the use of the camera to document illicit activities in the film. We wouldn't consider these activities very illicit. However, just getting out of the Victorian era, how this couple here is embracing. He has a drink in his hand. She has her arm across his body towards her leg. It was very much a different lifestyle being portrayed in this film. And here are my sources, many different sources, who these people were, the cameras. And for next week, we're going to talk about devastation and the rise of modern consumerism from the 1930s to the 1950s. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Questions, anybody?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, it seemed to me like we literally went across the street from Victorian and we turned around and there we were, just put loose and fancy free, so to speak. Did it appear that way to you? It's like, oh, it was Victorian, 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 and then all of a sudden we were like, woo! We threw off our hats and our gloves and our scarves and our corsets and whatever, and then we were just running around. So what are your thoughts on that transition in photography from the Victorian, where they were, I noticed in your photos, they were all the way up to the necks, and then all of a sudden we were seeing legs and, you know, short skirts. So what was a quick transition from Victorian photography over into the photography that covered the jazz, started focusing on the jazz era?
I think the transition was primarily all the social progress which was happening. Women were coming out, and it's women in particular, because the men's fashion stayed pretty much the suit with the vest and the tie or the bow tie and the hat, very samey. But when women started changing their social political mindset, women started going, well, I can't really go out to work with a dress that's all the way down to the ground. I need some distance between the hem of my skirt and the floor. And so I think history and fashion came together, and people thought, it needs to be easier for me to move about. And when people started moving about, women started traveling together. As you saw, the women on the beach with the fashion police. And so the mindset, society changed, mindsets changed, the clothing changed to match the mindsets, and the photography was able to document the jump.
Okay.
The jump was, it was breakneck speed, because you still had mothers and grandmothers wearing the petticoat, the undercoat, the bloomers, the crinoline, the long dress, down to the wrist, down to the ankles, up to the neck. And they're looking at their daughters and granddaughters going, oh my goodness, they're practically naked. You know, it was very jarring for the Victorian elders in that time. But yeah, a whole bunch of things happen at once. And when a whole bunch of things happen at once, people decide we're going to change.
Yeah, it seemed like photography in turning from the left to the right, just kind of in the moment documented the Victorian and swept to the right, and in that same frame, so to speak, documented 2 or 3 generations where they look totally different. So I thought that was interesting to see that not even that the same generation that raised the next generation, they were so different in how photography was presenting the moms, the grandmom, and the daughters and granddaughters in 3 different frames, 3 different styles of dressing. Photography captured it well.
Yeah, it was very, very, very stark differences. There's some photos, but there weren't that many that I found where it's the grandmother and the mother and then the granddaughter, and they're all dressed how they're, in the 20s would dress, what they're comfortable for dressing. And you just see the very stern upper lip, the disdain for the short dress showing the ankles. It's not that big of a deal to us, but for them back then, it was everything. It was it it was breaking down Victorian values. Women going out and commingling, pictures of people drinking during the alcohol prohibition. It threw a lot of elders for a loop.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
Actually, I had one more. In one of the images, I saw the black face, and I don't remember. I stepped away for a moment, so I don't remember if you cover. I don't remember covering that. Were those African Americans with the black face? Their hands, unless their hands were gloved, I wasn't sure. Yeah, that image. Were those African Americans with the black face? Why would an African American person do the black face?
Oh, that's a good question. These were white men.
Oh, they were.
Their hands.
I saw that their hands were not black.
Their hands. This gentleman doesn't. Do they have gloves? Maybe they have gloves. It looks like they have gloves, but these were white men that Josephine Baker were made to create. I wouldn't consider it art, but it could create with. And minstrel shows were very popular, and they were a mockery of the African American male performer. Men like Duke Ellington, who wore the suit, the tie, and performed and sang. And so it was a pantomiming of Black American men made by white American men. And also minstrel shows went over to Europe. However, they were popular there, but it wasn't widely embraced like the United States was. So yeah, good question and good eye.
Yeah, I saw that, and like I said, I don't remember hearing you mention anything about them in particular.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They are clearly in the photo right there. And I thought, were those African American men? But yeah, in looking at their hands, I immediately said those are not people of color, unless they were gloved. And then I thought, not sure if they were gloved or not. But that's interesting that in that photo moment, they captured that, and it spoke volumes about what people thought about other people. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And Josephine Baker as a female performer, I'm pretty sure she, in her time, saw that and went, oh, okay, so they're making money making fun of us. I'm going to make money making fun of what you think we are. So I'm going to sing and I'm going to dance. I actually was able to get moving GIFs, which was very exciting from the internet. And she's having fun. I, you know, now we'd probably consider her canceled because, she's performing stereotypically, but the knowledge of performing stereotypically shows a high level of intelligence because she went back home. She lived out her days as a professional military woman and as a mother. So this was very much her getting a chance to get out of the racist Midwest, St. Louis, Missouri, travel, meet people, live a life that she probably would have never met if she hadn't have left and constantly ran away from being a maid for the same people that would turn around and also make fun with the minstrel shows of her culture and her people. So she had a very interesting life. I invite everyone to go on YouTube and look up documentaries about her from the beginning of her life to the end of her life. Astonishing, just some of the things she went through and how people went through and yet still managed to have a life, have a career, make something of themselves, make something for themselves, and also provide for children. Although she never was a biological mother to any of these children, she did take care of them and raise them very well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Anything you found interesting? Let me go back. Open up the side panel. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Next week, we're going to jump to it. We're going to be talking about the devastation seen in the 1930s and the rise of modern consumerism. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your time, and I will see you next week.